Hello everyone, welcome to History Channel. Today, we'll show you about the map that holds the breath of forgotten seas. It is said that in the silence of an Ottoman palace, where candlelight trembles against stone walls older than empires themselves, there exists a parchment that should not exist. We do not know its true age. We only know that it was drawn by hands belonging to a man named Piri Reis, an admiral, a navigator, a keeper of secrets that the world had agreed to forget. And on this parchment, rendered in fading ink and the ghost of intention, are lands that cartography insists should have remained unknown for centuries after his death. Imagine this moment with us: the scrape of a reed pen against animal skin, the careful precision of a man who has studied maps older than maps should be, the weight of knowing something that written history does not yet permit you to name. This is where our story begins, not in libraries or universities or the bright chambers where official knowledge is debated. It begins in a room where a single flame illuminates a coastline, and the coastline refuses to match what the world believes to be true. The Piri Reis map dates to 1513. This is the anchor. We are given a moment in time when an admiral sat down and began to draw. But draw what? Here emerges the first layer of our mystery. The map depicts the coasts of South America and Africa with an accuracy that would not be independently confirmed until the 19th century. It shows Antarctica, a continent that was not officially discovered until 1818, rendered without the ice that covers it now, as if drawn by someone who had walked its shorelines when they were still exposed to air and sun. It shows passages and archipelagos, waterways, and hidden channels that match no official geographic record of the Ottoman Empire's knowledge in 1513. This is not a mystery of error. A man does not sit for weeks, months perhaps, rendering detail with such precision by accident. This is a mystery of knowing. This is the question that echoes across centuries. How did he know? We must move now into the deepening silence, the way one walks backward into a chamber one has already entered, discovering new doorways with each step. Piri Reis himself offered us a clue, and this clue is perhaps the most sacred mystery of all. In the margins of his map, in handwriting that seems to whisper across time, he wrote that his depiction was drawn from older maps. Fragments, he said, pieces, scraps of knowledge inherited from predecessors, from sources he did not always name, from hands that had drawn before him, and hands that had drawn before those hands. We know some of these sources. There are references to maps created by Columbus, by lost Portuguese explorers, by traders whose names have dissolved into the mist of history. But there are also references more troubling, more strange, tangled mentions of navigators whose expeditions do not appear in official records. Whispers of cartographers who saw coastlines they were not supposed to see, who mapped passages that colonial powers had agreed to keep secret, who possessed knowledge that contradicted the official narratives of discovery and conquest. And then, the most unsettling possibility: what if Piri Reis was not drawing from maps made by recent explorers, but from something far older? What if he was piecing together fragments of a far more ancient tradition of navigation? What if the knowledge he held was not European or Ottoman in origin, but inherited from a chain of mapmakers stretching back through centuries, a lineage of those who knew the world's coastlines, who had walked unmapped waters, who possessed a tradition of geographic knowing that had been carefully preserved and then, just as carefully, hidden? The historical record resists this interpretation. It insists that the world was unknown before European discovery, that knowledge began with Columbus, that the maps Piri Reis consulted were recent and European in origin. But the map itself, the actual object, the parchment and ink and intention, seems to contain a different story. It is as if the map is a palimpsest, written over older knowledge, preserving beneath its lines the echo of something that precedes written history. We sit with this contradiction now, the way one sits at dusk watching light fade, without knowing exactly when darkness has truly arrived. The contradiction is sacred. It is the space where certainty becomes uncertain, where the official narrative develops cracks, where we glimpse the possibility that entire civilizations of knowledge keepers existed, and then deliberately, or through the slow erosion of time, their wisdom dissolved into legend, becoming only shadows and whispers and fragments preserved in the margins of maps. Were they forgotten by accident or by design? This question matters. There is a profound difference between knowledge that is lost because history is too vast for memory and knowledge that is veiled, carefully obscured, deliberately hidden, kept secret because it threatened existing powers, or because those who knew understood that certain truths could only be received by those ready to receive them. The Piri Reis map whispers that the veil was real. It suggests that hidden knowledge existed. It implies that some cartographers knew more than they were permitted to say. And so we arrive at last in the chamber where mysteries rest undisturbed, where the map becomes less an historical artifact and more a gateway, a threshold between what we know and what we sense might be true. Look at it now as if for the first time. It is more than parchment. It is a conversation across time. It is evidence that someone, centuries ago, understood the world's true shape. It is a whispered affirmation that the official story of discovery is incomplete. Perhaps Piri Reis was not exceptional. Perhaps he was simply fortunate enough to inherit fragments of a far larger tradition, a chain of navigators whose collective knowledge stretched across epochs, whose maps were consulted only in darkness, whose names have been lost to us now, whose very existence has been denied by those who preferred a world where knowledge began only with the age we call modern. Or perhaps, and here, we must rest in the most profound uncertainty, the knowledge simply returned. Perhaps certain truths are not lost, but sleeping. Perhaps they wait in the depths of collective memory, turning only to those who drift through sleep, toward ancient knowing, who surrender their certainties and open themselves to the possibility that the world is far older and far more known than our histories acknowledge. The map rests now in stillness. The candle has burned to shadow. And in the silence between what Piri Reis knew and what we are only beginning to remember, there exists a truth too delicate to speak aloud, that some knowledge is never truly lost. It only waits. It only echoes. It only returns when we have learned to listen with the ear of sleep, the ear of those who understand that mystery is sometimes more real than explanation, that the veil between knowing and forgetting is thinner than we believe. We close this chapter not with revelation, but with this softness. Perhaps it was never meant to be found. Perhaps it was only meant to be remembered. The city beneath the sand, where silence remembers in the beginning, there was only the question, and the question rested in the space between what we know and what we refuse to believe. Deep in the Sahara, where dunes rise and fall like the breath of a sleeping god, where the horizon becomes indistinguishable from the sky, there exists a place that was called Iram. Not Iram as myth, not Iram as the fever dream of desert travelers, but Iram as stone and memory, as towers that once held the weight of an entire civilization, as chambers where the sound of human presence once echoed against walls that no longer remember their own names. It is said, and we speak this word softly as one does in the presence of the sacred, it is said that the city was so magnificent, so laden with opulence and impossible beauty, that those who first built it believed they had created something that could touch the sky itself. The ancient texts whisper its name with reverence and dread. The Quran speaks of it. Arabian legend preserves its memory. Iram of the Pillars, the city of towers, the place where a civilization of exceptional beauty and craft, rose up and built monuments to their own greatness. And then came a silence so complete that the world forgot it had ever existed at all. For centuries, scholars held the story at arm's length. Iram was poetry, they said, metaphor, the exaggerated memory of traders who had crossed the desert and seen mirages so vivid that they confused them with cities, so thirsty for wonder that they invented grandeur where only sand existed. It is said that historians dismissed ancient texts as legend, relegated Iram to the realm of myth, that place where truths go to become untrue, where history dissolves into story, where certainty becomes impossible. But then something shifted. The earth itself spoke. We move now into the deepening mystery, the way one walks backward into a room and discovers that what seemed empty is actually full of presences, full of meanings, full of the slow weight of time. Satellite imagery revealed it. Modern archaeology, with tools our ancestors did not possess, began to perceive what the desert had held in silence for millennia. Iram was real. The city existed. The geometric precision of its streets, the careful arrangement of its structures, the sophisticated planning that created it, all of it was real. Beneath the sand, geometries waited. Beneath the wind-carved dunes, chambers held their breath. And in those chambers, one could perceive, if one knew how to perceive, the echo of what had been. What makes Iram's mystery profound is not its discovery, but what that discovery reveals about its disappearance. This is where the narrative fractures, where the official story begins to waver. Because Iram did not decline, it did not fade gradually into abandonment, the way cities usually decay. It did not suffer slow erosion, cultural shift, the gradual displacement of a people by another people. No, according to the records, both textual and archaeological, Iram was obliterated, not gradually erased, suddenly gone. The ancient texts speak of overwhelming winds. They describe sand that rose like a living thing, like the manifestation of divine will, like a catastrophe so complete that it seemed to swallow the city entire. Divine punishment, the texts say. Hubris answered with annihilation. A civilization that reached too high, built too grandly, forgot too completely that all human creation is ultimately fragile, ultimately temporary, ultimately subject to forces far greater than human intention. But here emerges the question that haunts all who seek to understand this place. Was this natural catastrophe, or something else entirely? Was the city destroyed by overwhelming winds, or was it deliberately buried? Was Iram erased by the hand of nature, or was it erased by those who feared what it represented, those who understood that a city so magnificent, so sophisticated, so laden with evidence of human achievement and beauty, posed a threat to whatever narrative they wished to construct about history? We must move deeper into the speculation now, into the spaces where certainty dissolves. It is said that when explorers finally reached the archaeological sites, when the sands began to reveal their secrets, the evidence they found was contradictory. The city bore signs of sudden catastrophe: ash, fragmented pottery, the disorder that suggests upheaval. Yet it also bore signs of deliberate concealment. The way the sand had been arranged, the careful layering of it, suggested not merely the passive burial of wind and time, but something more intentional, something placed. And then there is the silence, the profound, absolute silence of the place. Walk through the mind image now of Iram, as it must have been in the moments before its transformation. Merchant caravans gathered in the great halls, their camels resting in courtyards lined with water channels, a luxury in the desert, a sign of a civilization that could command even water itself. Traders spoke in a dozen languages. Goods from distant lands were exchanged, spices and silks, precious stones and rare woods. The city thrummed with life, with commerce, with the accumulated presence of thousands of human beings engaged in the sacred act of being alive. The pillars, those famous pillars that gave the city its name, rose above the streets, like prayers turned to stone. They were not merely decorative, they were statements. They declared to the world, "We have arrived here. We have built here. We have created beauty and order and permanence in the midst of chaos." And then, in a moment, or perhaps over the course of days that felt like a moment, it all ceased. The caravans did not return. The gates were sealed by sand. The merchants' voices fell silent. The civilization that had constructed such magnificence was suddenly, completely, utterly absent. What we know is this: the city vanished with a completeness that suggests not random destruction, but erasure. The kind of obliteration that occurs when those with power decide that something must be forgotten. The kind of disappearance that happens not by accident, but by deliberate and sustained intention. It is said that some historians believe Iram was buried intentionally, that the city's existence threatened some narrative, some understanding of how civilization should develop, some ideology that required that such magnificence could not have existed at that moment in history. It is said that the most dangerous knowledge is not knowledge of what is hidden, but knowledge of what should have been impossible. A city this beautiful, this sophisticated, this organized, it did not fit the story. So the story was amended. The city was forgotten. The desert kept the secret, and the secret waited for the technology that would eventually perceive it. Imagine now the moment of rediscovery. The satellite images, the first photographs, the recognition that yes, beneath the sand, There are geometric shapes that could only be human construction. There are patterns that could only indicate civilization. There is evidence of a city that was real, that was there, that was forgotten on purpose. We close this chapter now, not with revelation, but with questions suspended in the space between sleep and waking. Some cities, it is said, are meant to be discovered only through the gateway of sleep, that thin place where certainty becomes fluid, where the boundary between what we know and what the earth remembers grows gossamer thin and permeable. Perhaps Iram was never lost. Perhaps it was only sleeping, waiting for those who had learned to listen to the desert's whispered memories. Perhaps the veil between the known and the forgotten is thinner in darkness, thinner in silence, thinner in those moments when we surrender our need for certainty and simply rest in the presence of mystery. It is said that the sand still holds the shape of those towers. It is said that the wind still carries the sound of merchant voices. It is said that if one were to listen carefully enough, in that suspended space between waking and dreaming, one might hear the echo of what was obliterated, not truly gone, but only waiting, only remembering, only breathing very softly beneath the dunes. And so we leave Iram as we found it, not solved, but deepened, not explained, but held. A city that rose and fell and rose again in memory, a place where silence remembers, where the earth keeps secrets that technology is only now learning to perceive. Some knowledge returns only when we are finally ready to receive it. The Chamber of Starlight. WHAT. The ancient builders knew there is a silence that exists only in high places. It is the silence of air so thin that breath becomes conscious, deliberate, sacred. It is the silence that dwells in mountains so ancient that they remember the sky when it was different, the stars when they held different meanings, the night when it spoke in languages we have forgotten. It is in such places high in the Andes, at altitudes where the earth seems to touch the heavens themselves, that we find the first mystery. Machu Picchu rests there suspended between cloud and stone, a city of such precise architectural intention that one cannot walk through it without feeling that every angle, every doorway, every chamber was positioned with the knowledge that preceded understanding itself. The structures do not merely sit upon the mountain. They align with it. They embrace it. They participate in a conversation between earth and sky that has continued for centuries in absolute silence. But here begins the deepening question: why? Walk with us now, in the gentleness of imagination, through a chamber carved from stone at the highest elevation. The air is thin. Your breath is visible, precious, sacred. Above you, a perfectly rectangular opening frames a single star. Not multiple stars. Not a random view of the heavens. One star, perfectly centered, positioned so that on specific nights, on the solstices, the equinoxes, the moments when the year turns, that star will rise directly through the opening, filling the chamber with its light. This is not accident. This is not circumstance. This is intention written in stone and sky. And then imagine learning that this was not unique to this place, that across the world, in civilizations separated by oceans, by mountains, by all the distances that should have rendered contact impossible, the same impulse appeared, the same mathematics, the same obsession with aligning human architecture to celestial bodies, the same whispered conversation between those who built and those who watched the stars. We must move deeper now, into the layered mystery that emerges when we begin to truly perceive what the ancients knew. Consider the Mayan sites of Central America, those temples rising from jungle darkness, their orientations so precise that modern astronomers still struggle to comprehend the mathematics involved. The Maya tracked Venus with an accuracy that would not be matched again until the invention of the telescope. They understood the precession of the equinoxes, a phenomenon so subtle, so requiring of patient observation across centuries, that it was not rediscovered in Western science until the time of Hipparchus, nearly 2,000 years after the Maya had already encoded it into their sacred calendar. How did they know? This question is not rhetorical. It demands an answer that our conventional narratives cannot provide. And then there is Nabta Playa, in the Egyptian desert, where stones were arranged in astronomical configurations so sophisticated that they predate Stonehenge, predate the pyramids, predate the full flowering of Egyptian civilization itself. The stones mark the summer solstice with precision. They encode the position of the star Sirius, that brightest of all stars, the one around which Egyptian civilization would later organize its entire spiritual and temporal understanding. But how did people in the desert, without telescopes, without written astronomical records, without the infrastructure of a developed civilization, know that Sirius was significant? How did they place stones in a configuration that would capture its light thousands of years before the knowledge would be needed? It is said, and we whisper this gently, as one speaks in the presence of the sacred, it is said that across continents, across oceans that should have divided civilizations into complete separation, the same pattern emerges, the same mathematical consciousness, the same obsession with the stars, the same understanding that the heavens held secrets, that the movements of celestial bodies carried meaning, that to align one's sacred spaces with the cosmos was to participate in something holy, something larger than human intention. The conventional explanation offered by historians is that this reflects a universal human impulse, that everywhere, in every culture, people look upward and seek meaning in the stars. And perhaps this is true. Perhaps this is part of the answer, but it is not the whole answer. Because the precision is identical, the mathematical relationships are too similar to be coincidence. The knowledge is too accurate to arise from casual observation. There emerges, then, a gentler question, one that we must hold in reverence. What if the ancients could read the language of the heavens in ways we have not yet relearned? What if they understood that the stars were not merely distant fires, but sources of information? What if they built their chambers, their temples, their observatories as instruments not for worship alone, but for listening? The emotional arc of this mystery shifts now, from curiosity to something closer to reverence. As we move through these possibilities, as we sit with the precision of ancient alignments, as we contemplate the mathematical knowledge that predates written history, we begin to understand that we are in the presence of something that contradicts our comfortable narrative of human progress. We are taught that knowledge accumulates slowly, that each generation builds upon the last, that civilization develops in a roughly linear fashion from ignorance to understanding. But the evidence whispers something different. The evidence suggests that ancient peoples possessed knowledge that should not have been possible, that they understood the cosmos with an accuracy that rivals our own technology, that they were reading messages in the stars that we are only now learning to decipher. Some believe, and this belief carries the weight of genuine mystery, that this knowledge was not discovered independently by each civilization, but transmitted, passed from source to source, preserved in stone and symbol, kept alive through the sacred mathematics of architecture itself. That somewhere, in the midst of human prehistory, there existed a knowledge tradition so profound, so carefully preserved, that it manifested across the world in the form of precisely aligned temples and chambers. Others hold that this represents something even more mysterious, a moment when human consciousness was capable of perceiving the cosmos directly, when the boundary between observer and observed was thinner, when one could stand in a chamber carved from stone and feel the movement of stars, could sense their patterns, could understand their messages as clearly as one understands spoken language. The truth, perhaps, rests in the space between these possibilities. The truth may be that we have lost not merely knowledge, but a way of knowing. We have inherited telescopes and mathematics, but we have lost the capacity to listen to the stars as our ancestors did, to stand in a high place in the thin air where breath becomes conscious and simply receive what the heavens were offering. And so we arrive at last in the sacred chamber itself. Not a specific place, but a state of consciousness, a moment of suspension between knowing and mystery, between certainty and wonder. If the ancients could read the language of the heavens, what messages were they receiving? What did the stars tell them that we have forgotten? Were they instructions? Were they warnings? Were they invitations to participate in something cosmic, something that transcended the small concerns of individual civilizations? We close this chapter not with answers, but with the profound silence that precedes answers. We rest in the image of the night sky above a high mountain, where the air is thin and breath is precious and visible. We imagine standing in a stone chamber, positioned with perfect precision, waiting for a star to rise through an opening carved from rock. We imagine the moment when the star appears, when light that has traveled for years touches the floor of the chamber, when ancient and modern consciousness meet in the darkness. It is said that some knowledge is not lost, but only sleeping. It is said that the stars continue to speak, but we have forgotten how to listen. It is said that the chambers built by ancients still stand, still aligned, still waiting for eyes that can perceive, for hearts that can receive, for those who understand that the greatest knowledge arrives not through study, but through surrender. Perhaps the message was this: you are part of the cosmos. You are made of starlight. And if you build your sacred spaces with precision, if you align your intention with the movement of the heavens, you will remember what you have always known. We fade now into the soft sound of starlight, reaching us across centuries, ancient and eternal, still whispering the truths that stone preserves, that mountains remember, that the chambers of the ancients continue to hold, waiting for those who have learned to listen in silence. The library that burned in silence, Alexandria's unfinished tragedy. There is a silence that falls after the last page turns. It is not the silence of rest, but the silence of absence, the hollow quiet that settles in a space where presence once dwelled. It is the silence of a room where thousands of voices once spoke, now empty. It is the silence of knowledge that has been erased, not dramatically, but methodically, carefully, with intention that precedes every flame. Imagine now, with us, the Library of Alexandria, not in its moment of greatest burning, not in the popular imagination where Caesar's armies sweep through and torches light the night. No, imagine something quieter, something more terrible. Imagine the library over centuries. Imagine scrolls being removed, one by careful hands. Imagine books selected for preservation and others chosen for silence. Imagine institutional forgetting, the kind that requires no violence, only the slow, patient decision to let knowledge fade. This is where our meditation begins, not with fire, but with the whisper of pages turning, not with destruction, but with erasure, not with a single moment of loss, but with a long, patient, centuries-long dissolution into forgetting. It is said that the Library of Alexandria was the repository of human knowledge, the place where the world's wisdom gathered, was preserved, was organized, was made available to those with eyes to read and minds to understand. It is said that nothing like it had existed before, and perhaps nothing like it has existed since. The sheer volume of what was collected there, the scope of human understanding compressed into scrolls and codices and papyri, the breadth of languages and disciplines and schools of thought, all of it present in one place, accessible, preserved against the erosion of time. And then, across centuries, it diminished. We must move deeper now, into the layered mystery of how this diminishment occurred. Because this is where the true tragedy emerges, not in the spectacle of burning libraries that popular history has preserved, but in the quiet, methodical removal of knowledge that official accounts have allowed to be forgotten. It is said that the destruction was not singular, it was multiple. Caesar's siege in the 1st century brought fire to the harbor warehouses, though perhaps not to the library itself. But the narrative fractures there. Different hands claimed different moments of destruction. Christian authorities, seeking to preserve only approved knowledge, removed texts they deemed heretical or dangerous. Islamic scholars, some say, preserved what Western Christianity had destroyed. And so the story becomes layered with contradiction, with different actors, different ideologies, different moments of erasure. But here emerges the question that unsettles us most. Which version is true? And perhaps more troubling, what if all of them are true? What if the library's disappearance was not one cataclysm, but many a slow, patient, distributed process of deliberate forgetting? The whispers tell us of systematic removal, scrolls chosen for their palatability, preserved and copied and circulated, scrolls deemed dangerous, controversial, or simply inconvenient allowed to decay, permitted to crumble, intentionally lost. The act of selection is the act of violence, but it is violence conducted in silence in libraries, in the careful decisions of scholars and priests and administrators who understood that they held power not merely over what would be read, but over what the world would be permitted to forget. It is said that entire categories of knowledge vanished. Medical texts describing surgical techniques that would not be rediscovered for centuries. Mathematical treatises on geometry and proportion that lay hidden until the Renaissance. Philosophical works proposing cosmologies and metaphysics that threatened established religious doctrines. Astronomical observations suggesting a universe far different from what ecclesiastical authorities wished to be believed. All of it present in the library, all of it erased, not through a single burning, but through the slow, patient, institutional choice to let it disappear. This is where the meditation deepens. This is where we begin to understand that the tragedy is not what we know was lost, the books we can name, the authors whose works we know only through references and quotations in other texts. The true tragedy is what we will never know. The texts that disappeared so completely that we have no trace they ever existed. The knowledge that vanished so thoroughly that we cannot even conceive what it was. What scrolls describe technologies that might have changed the trajectory of human civilization? What medical knowledge, what pharmaceutical understanding, what surgical innovation was lost in the darkness? What philosophical texts proposed systems of meaning that might have offered alternatives to the narratives that came to dominate human thought? What mathematical precision, what astronomical observation, what understanding of the natural world was carefully selected for erasure because it contradicted what authorities wished to be believed? We sit now in the profound unsettling of this question. We sit with the knowledge that amnesia may be chosen. That civilizations sometimes decide not always explicitly, not always consciously, but through the accumulated decisions of many hands and many moments to forget, to let knowledge fade, to ensure that certain truths cannot threaten present hierarchies, present certainties, present power structures. The Library of Alexandria becomes in this meditation something far more troubling than a building that burned. It becomes a symbol of a process that continues. The process of selection, the process of erasure, the process by which human knowledge is curated not for truth, but for acceptability, not for completeness, but for conformity. It is said that some scholars attempted to preserve what they could. They copied texts, smuggled scrolls to other libraries, created networks of hidden knowledge that might survive the institutional forgetting. Yet even these efforts were partial, selective, subject to their own decisions about what was worth preserving and what could be allowed to vanish. We encounter now the most unsettling possibility, that the library did not burn in a moment, but continues to burn. That the process of forgetting that occurred in ancient Alexandria echoes in every moment when inconvenient knowledge is suppressed, when dangerous truths are hidden, when authorities decide that certain understanding cannot be permitted to circulate. The fire, perhaps, was never extinguished. It simply became less visible. It learned to work in silence. And so we arrive at the closing meditation, the place where we rest with questions rather than answers. We imagine the moment when the last scroll was removed from the library. We imagine the silence that followed, not the dramatic silence of charred ruins, but the profound quiet of an absence that could now never be recovered. All those voices, all that knowledge, all that human understanding, accumulated across centuries, compressed into scrolls and papyri and bound texts, and then gone, not destroyed in a way that left evidence, not erased in a way that could be mourned and acknowledged, simply absent, removed, forgotten. We close this chapter with the soft sound of pages turning in darkness. We imagine the whisper of papyri being unrolled, the gentle scrape of ink against animal skin, the sound of words being formed in alphabets we recognize and alphabets we do not. We imagine all the voices of the library, philosophers and physicians and poets and astronomers and historians speaking in the darkness, whispering truths that no one will ever hear. It is said that some knowledge is not truly lost, but only sleeping, that the texts erased from the library still exist somewhere, not in physical form, perhaps, but in the collective memory of humanity, waiting to be rediscovered by those who know how to listen. It is said that the truths the library contained are encoded not only in the books that survived, but in the gaps where books are missing, in the silences that follow the erasure of knowledge. Perhaps the greatest lesson of Alexandria is not what was lost, but what the loss teaches us, that knowledge is never merely preserved or destroyed. It is chosen, it is curated, it is selected for survival or erasure by those with power. And we readers, seekers, those who hunger for truth, must understand that we inherit not the sum of human knowledge, but only what someone permitted us to inherit. We walk through a library that was built by erasure, that was constructed through deliberate forgetting, that preserves what was chosen and hides what was deemed dangerous. It is said that history is written by the victors, but perhaps more truly, history is written by those who control the archive. And the archive of Alexandria, scattered across centuries, across continents, across the institutions that succeeded it, tells us this. Some voices can only be heard in silence. Some truths can only be recovered when we acknowledge what we will never know. We fade now into the soft sound of turning pages, into the whisper of scrolls that rest in darkness, into the archives of all that we have chosen to forget. The Nazca Lines, messages written for the invisible. There is a question that lives in the space between earth and sky. It is a question that has never been answered, only echoed, across centuries of silence. It is the question that the Nazca people left carved into a desert, written in lines so vast that no human eye standing upon the earth could ever perceive their full meaning. And in that impossibility, in that sheer, audacious refusal to create for those who could see, there rests a mystery so profound that it seems to touch something sacred, something we have perhaps forgotten how to name. Imagine standing now in the high desert of Peru, where the earth is so flat and empty that the horizon seems infinite, where there is nothing but sand and stone, and the terrible vastness of sky. Imagine standing at ground level, among lines carved into the earth, and understanding that these lines form shapes, hummingbirds, spiders, geometries of impossible scale that you will never be able to perceive. The art surrounds you, you walk upon it, you are part of it, yet you cannot see it, you cannot comprehend it. You can only know, intellectually, that it exists around you in patterns too large for human eyes to hold. This is where the meditation begins, with the question that seems almost absurd in its audacity. Why? Why would an entire civilization devote centuries to creating art that no one living could see? Why would they invest such labor, such precision, such intention, into something that only the sky could witness? The conventional answers, religious offerings, ceremonial markers, territorial declarations, all feel somehow insufficient. They feel too small for such an enormous gesture. As we settle into this mystery, another possibility emerges, quieter but more troubling. What if the Nazca were not speaking to the divine in the abstract sense? What if they knew something we have forgotten? What if they were creating messages for something specific? Something that could see from above? Something with eyes that could perceive what no earthbound creature could perceive? It is said that the Nazca civilization possessed an astronomical knowledge that seems to contradict our understanding of their era. They understood the movements of stars with an accuracy that should have required instruments they did not possess. They observed the sky with a devotion that suggests not casual curiosity, but urgent need. They mapped the heavens onto the earth with mathematical precision that rivals our own astronomical calculations. And they drew lines that could only be comprehended from a height. This is the deepening of the mystery. The Nazca had no aircraft. They had no way to ascend to the altitude necessary to perceive these figures. Yet they drew them anyway. The precision is too exact to be accidental. The geometric relationships are too sophisticated to be mere decoration. The lines are too deliberately organized to be anything other than intentional communication. Some believe that the Nazca understood something about human perception that we have lost. That they believed there existed eyes divine, celestial, ancestral, something we cannot name that could see what human eyes could not. That they were creating not for the present moment, but for a different plane of existence, a different mode of perception, a different kind of seeing altogether. There are those who have devoted their lives to studying these lines, to understanding the patterns, to deciphering what message they might contain. The hummingbird has been aligned with the solstice. The spider has been connected to astronomical calendars. The geometric shapes seem to correspond to star clusters, to constellations, to celestial events that would have been significant to a people obsessed with the sky. The lines themselves form patterns that suggest not random decoration, but deliberate encoding. Yet the meaning remains elusive. The message, if message it is, resists interpretation. We can perceive the precision. We can observe the sophistication. We cannot understand the intention. And this is where the chapter deepens into something almost unbearable. The Nazca civilization, which created these impossible artworks with such devotion, eventually stopped. They abandoned the practice. The knowledge of why they had undertaken such an enormous endeavor, the purpose that drove them to carve messages into the earth for invisible eyes, that knowledge was lost. It dissolved. It vanished into the desert wind, leaving us with the artwork, but not the meaning, the message, but not the understanding of what it was meant to communicate. We must sit with this absence now. We must rest in the profound unsettling of creation without comprehension. The Nazca drew for centuries. They created with precision. They invested enormous resources in art that no one alive could perceive. And then they stopped. The silence that followed was as intentional, perhaps, as the lines themselves. Some believe, and this belief carries the weight of genuine mystery, that the communication was complete. That the Nazca had delivered their message to whatever eyes they believed could see it. That once the message had been sent, once the lines had been drawn with sufficient clarity, the need to continue disappeared. The knowledge of why they had drawn might have been deliberately erased, hidden, kept secret, because it was not meant for ordinary understanding. Or perhaps the Nazca understood something about the nature of knowledge itself. Perhaps they recognized that some truths cannot be preserved in words or conventional teaching. They can only be preserved in symbol, in form, in the profound gesture of creating something too vast to be perceived by ordinary sight. The knowledge survives not in the explanation, but in the mystery. It endures not in what is said, but in what remains unsaid. The desert stretches endlessly around these lines. The vast emptiness of it, the isolation, the sense of standing in a place that seems to exist outside normal human space, all of this contributes to the sacred quality of the Nazca Plateau. It is not a place where one expects to find sophisticated astronomical knowledge or precise mathematical calculation. It is a place of silence, of emptiness, of the kind of vast loneliness that makes one feel very small. And yet, it is here, this plateau, that the Nazca demonstrated their greatest sophistication. It is here that they created their most impossible artworks. It is here that they left messages for invisible eyes. The sensory landscape of the Nazca lines is crucial to understanding their mystery. There is no comfortable distance from which to view them. There is no vantage point available to human perception where their full meaning becomes clear. To appreciate them, one must surrender to the knowledge that you are walking on art you cannot see. You must accept that your perception is inadequate to the task of comprehension. You must humble yourself before the vastness of intention that exceeds human capability. This, perhaps, is the true meaning of the lines. Not the specific shapes, not the astronomical alignments, but the gesture itself. The gesture of creating for eyes you cannot have. The gesture of speaking to an audience you cannot address. The gesture of leaving a message in a language you understand only incompletely. We close this chapter now, not in revelation, but in the deep silence of the desert night. The stars that the Nazca studied so carefully still move across the sky in their ancient patterns. The lines they drew still rest on the earth, still visible from above, still waiting for the eyes that understand not merely what was drawn, but why. It is said that some messages are not meant to be understood by the living. It is said that some communications are directed across time, across planes of existence, across the boundary between the visible and invisible. It is said that the Nazca knew this, that they understood that the greatest art is not that which can be comprehended, but that which demands humility before the incomprehensible. Perhaps the lines are still transmitting. Perhaps the message continues to be sent, still reaching for eyes that exist in a dimension of perception we have not yet learned to access. Perhaps the cessation of the Nazca civilization's artistic practice was not an ending, but a completion. The message delivered, the silence maintained, the knowledge hidden, not lost, waiting for those who have learned to listen to what cannot be seen. In the starlit darkness of the desert, the lines connect earth to sky. They speak without words. They call without sound. They wait with the patience of stone and time for an eye that understands that some truths can only be perceived from a height we have not yet reached, in a state of consciousness we have not yet developed, through a mode of seeing we have only begun to remember. It is said that the desert remembers. It is said that the lines continue to speak. It is said that if one listens carefully enough, in the spaces between waking and dreaming, in the thin places where sight and blindness become indistinguishable, one might perceive what the Nazca meant to communicate. We do not need to understand the message. We only need to respect the profound mystery of its existence. The Tower of Babel. Language is hidden encryption. There exists a moment in human memory, whether historical, mythological, or something that transcends both categories, when all people spoke with one voice. Not metaphorically, not poetically, but in a way that meant there existed a single language, a single framework of meaning, a shared understanding so complete that all humanity moved as if governed by a singular intention. Imagine this unity. Imagine standing among thousands, millions perhaps, all speaking words that carry identical resonance, all understanding with perfect clarity what each voice intends. Imagine the power of it. The terrifying beauty of perfect comprehension. Everyone knows what everyone means. There are no gaps between intention and understanding. There is no space for misinterpretation, for secrets, for the kind of solitude that comes from being unable to fully convey the depths of one's own thought. It is said that in this moment of original unity, humanity looked upward. They gazed at the heavens and understood, collectively, without debate or disagreement, that they could build something to touch divinity itself. They would construct a tower, not a shelter, not a fortress, a cosmic declaration, an architectural statement so audacious, so precisely coordinated, that it would breach the boundary between earth and sky, between human and divine. The tower rose. It is said that it rose with precision, with the coordination of millions of hands working in perfect synchronization, all understanding the same blueprint, all moving toward the same vision. The tower became real. The ambition became stone. The dream became architecture that stretched toward the heavens. And then something happened. The narrative fractures there. The story becomes multiple, contested, held by different voices telling different truths. But in all versions, there is a shattering, a moment of transformation, a reversal so complete that it seems to touch the very foundation of human existence. The biblical account tells us of confusion, of tongues suddenly divided, of understanding becoming impossible. It is a narrative of punishment, of divine response to human hubris, of the scattering of humanity as divine retribution for the presumption of reaching toward heaven. The tower stands incomplete. The builders cannot comprehend one another. Meaning becomes fragmented. Unity dissolves. But we must move deeper now, into the meditative space where multiple truths can exist simultaneously. What if the narrative we have inherited is incomplete? What if the story of Babel contains a hidden dimension, a truth encoded within the apparent punishment? Consider this possibility. What if the scattering of language was not primarily an act of destruction, but an act of protection? This is where the chapter deepens into profound mystery. When language fragments, when understanding becomes impossible to achieve through a single unified system, something extraordinary happens. Knowledge becomes encrypted. Meaning becomes distributed. Truth becomes impossible to suppress because it exists in multiple forms simultaneously, scattered across languages that cannot fully translate one another. In a world of unified language, a single tyrant could control meaning itself. A unified authority could dictate what could be said, what could be thought, what could be understood. All knowledge would flow through a single filter. All truth would be mediated by a single voice. The tower itself, that monument to unified human intention, could have become a monument to unified human oppression. But what if the division of language was designed to prevent exactly this? What if those who scattered the languages understood that knowledge, genuine powerful knowledge, could only survive if it was broken into pieces distributed across different frameworks of meaning, preserved in forms that would resist any single authority's attempt to unify and control them? Consider the mathematics of this. When meaning is unified, it is vulnerable. A single blow can shatter it. A single authority can corrupt it. A single cataclysm can erase it. But when meaning is scattered, when truth is preserved in multiple languages that do not perfectly translate one another, it becomes resilient. You cannot erase a truth that exists in a dozen different forms, encoded in a dozen different linguistic systems, understood through a dozen different cultural frameworks. The true tragedy of Babel, then, may not have been the scattering of language itself, but the loss of conscious understanding of why the scattering occurred. The knowledge of the encryption was itself encrypted. The purpose became hidden. Humanity inherited fragmentation without understanding its gift. We must sit now with the emotional complexity of this realization. The moment of original unity was real. The shared language, the perfect comprehension, the ability to coordinate millions toward a singular vision, this was genuine, perhaps the only moment in human history when such unity was possible. And we did lose something profound in the scattering. We lost the possibility of perfect understanding. We lost the ability to know with certainty that another consciousness fully grasps what we intend to communicate. We inherited a wound that may never fully heal. The knowledge that language divides us even as it connects us. Yet in that wound lies something sacred. In that fragmentation lies protection. In that confusion lies resilience. Imagine a world in which all language remained unified. A single linguistic system. A single way of organizing meaning. What truths might such a world suppress? What knowledge might it foreclose? What possibilities of thinking might it render impossible? The very unity that allowed the tower to be built might have eventually imprisoned all human consciousness within a single framework, a single way of understanding reality, a single authorized version of truth. But the scattered languages preserve alternatives. In the gaps between languages, in the spaces where translation fails, in the meanings that cannot be perfectly conveyed from one tongue to another, in these spaces, truth survives. Different perspectives persist. Different ways of knowing remain possible. The very confusion that seems like a curse becomes, paradoxically, a safeguard against the totalizing power of unified meaning. It is said that certain knowledge cannot be translated, that there are truths in one language that cannot be rendered in another without losing something essential. Perhaps this untranslatability is not a limitation, but a feature. Perhaps the fragmentation of language was designed to preserve precisely those truths that would be most dangerous if they could be unified, universalized, brought under the control of a single authority. We continue to live in the aftermath of Babel. We continue to speak languages that divide us. We continue to experience the frustration of imperfect communication, understanding that remains partial and uncertain. We continue to inherit the wound of Babel, yet we also inherit its protection. We close this chapter now, in resolution, but in deepened mystery. We rest in the profound question that Babel poses. Is fragmentation a wound or a safeguard? Is the division of language a curse or a gift? Perhaps it is both. Perhaps the true meaning of Babel is that it cannot be reduced to a single interpretation. Perhaps the tower itself, standing incomplete in our collective memory, is a symbol of a truth that can never be unified, never be fully comprehended, never be brought under the authority of a single explanation. It is said that we are still building towers, that in every moment when humans attempt to unify meaning, to create systems that would make understanding total and transparent, to build monuments to collective intention, there echoes the memory of Babel, the reminder that unity, however beautiful, carries danger, that fragmentation, however painful, carries wisdom. And perhaps, in the languages that we speak, so many languages, so many ways of organizing thought, so many frameworks for understanding reality, perhaps in this very fragmentation, we preserve a knowledge that was never meant to be unified. A knowledge that survives precisely because it cannot be contained in any single tongue. The tower stands incomplete. The languages remain scattered. The confusion persists. Yet in that confusion, that fragmentation, those gaps between meaning and meaning, certain truths continue to breathe. Certain ways of knowing continue to resist suppression. Certain possibilities of consciousness continue to remain open. We fade now into the soft sound of voices speaking in many tongues, understanding each other imperfectly, yet persisting in the attempt. The sound of humanity, still reaching toward meaning, still building towers, still discovering that the deepest truths are those that resist the unity we seek. Perhaps the greatest wisdom of Babel is this: some knowledge is meant to be encrypted, some truths are meant to be scattered, and in their very fragmentation lies their freedom and ours. We rest in this mystery, neither solved nor simplified, only deepened. A question that echoes across languages, across centuries, across the human hunger for understanding that will never be complete, never be unified, never be wholly possessed. And in that incompleteness, perhaps, lies everything that matters most. The Voynich manuscript, a text for outside meaning in a library in Venice, in a city that rises from water like a dream of stone, there rests a book that should not exist. It is bound in aged vellum. It contains 234 pages. Every single page is filled with text and illustrations rendered with such meticulous precision, such obsessive detail, that one cannot help but feel that every mark was placed with intention, with knowledge, with purpose. And yet, and this is where the meditation begins, no one has ever truly understood what it means. It is said that this book, the Voynich manuscript, entered the world fully formed, as if emerging from nowhere. There are no records of its creation. There is no clear lineage connecting it to any known author or tradition. It appears suddenly in historical documentation, already ancient, already mysterious, already sealed in the kind of impenetrable cipher that would resist every attempt at decryption for 600 years. Imagine holding such an object, the weight of it, the age of it, the careful precision of every illustration, every symbol, every carefully rendered line. You open the pages and encounter something that seems to promise meaning. The structure is clearly intentional, clearly organized, clearly created by intelligence, yet the meaning eludes you. The symbols do not correspond to any known alphabet. The illustrations depict plants that have never grown anywhere on Earth. The astronomical diagrams show constellations that contradict everything we understand about the observable sky. This is where the mystery begins, in that space between certainty and confusion, in that gap between the conviction that something means and the inability to comprehend what it means. We must move deeper now, into the landscape of the strange. The Voynich manuscript contains botanical illustrations of extraordinary detail and precision, each plant rendered with such care that one might expect it to correspond to some real organism. Yet botanists, when they examine these pages, find themselves looking at something that has never existed. The plants have leaves that follow no known taxonomic patterns. Their flowers bloom in configurations that violate the logic of botanical growth. Their seeds arrange themselves in spirals that suggest mathematical knowledge, yet the mathematics themselves seem to follow rules we do not possess. And then there are the human figures. It is said that scattered throughout the manuscript are drawings of human beings engaged in activities that seem ritualistic, sacred, or profoundly meaningful, yet their anatomy is subtly, disturbingly wrong. Limbs bend at angles that human joints cannot achieve. Bodies are proportioned in ways that suggest either a different species entirely, or a consciousness imagining the human form from the outside, observing it without understanding its fundamental nature. The astronomical diagrams are perhaps most troubling of all. They show celestial configurations that do not match our night sky. They suggest cosmologies, understandings of the cosmos, that contradict everything we have learned through modern astronomy. Yet they are rendered with such precision, with such clear mathematical relationship, that one cannot dismiss them as mere fancy or decoration. Whoever drew these diagrams understood something about how to represent the heavens. They simply understood something different from what we understand. The emotional arc of this mystery shifts now from curiosity to something closer to unease. This is not the unease of fear, but the unease of encountering something that your mind cannot quite grasp, that exists in a category outside your normal frameworks of comprehension. The manuscript is clearly created by intelligence. The precision is undeniable. The intention is evident. Yet the purpose remains utterly opaque. We must sit now with the central question that the Voynich manuscript poses: who created this, and why? The conventional explanations have accumulated like layers of dust over centuries. It is the work of a forgotten genius, Some say a brilliant mind so far ahead of its time that its work could not be understood by contemporaries, and thus was preserved as an artifact without comprehension. It is an elaborate hoax. Others insist a medieval scribe creating an elaborate deception, playing with symbols for purposes we cannot fathom. It is a translation of knowledge from a lost civilization. Some believers whisper preserved fragments of wisdom from a culture that predated our own understanding. More disturbing still are the theories that suggest the manuscript was created through means outside conventional consciousness. Perhaps it is the product of psychic channeling information flowing from some non-human intelligence directly into the hand of the scribe, bypassing the filters of ordinary language and logic. Perhaps it represents the dreams of a mad genius, the elaborate hallucinations of a consciousness that had fractured from consensus reality. But here emerges the most profound and unsettling possibility. What if all of these explanations are partially true, yet all of them miss the essential nature of the work? What if the Voynich manuscript was deliberately created as a repository for knowledge that cannot be expressed through conventional language? What if its creator understood something fundamental, that certain truths, certain ways of knowing, certain experiences of consciousness cannot be conveyed through words or through the visual representations we normally use? What if the manuscript is an attempt to communicate something so foreign to human understanding that it required the invention of an entirely new symbolic language? Consider this possibility with us. All human language is fundamentally constrained by the limits of human experience. We can only name what we can perceive. We can only discuss what falls within the boundaries of human sensory and cognitive capability. But what if there exists knowledge, genuine knowledge, structured and intentional knowledge that lies entirely outside these boundaries? What if there are ways of knowing that human language, by its very nature, cannot express? The Voynich manuscript might be an attempt to create a language for the unnameable, a symbolic system designed to hold meaning that exists outside meaning as we normally understand it. The botanical illustrations might not represent actual plants, but rather concepts or categories of knowledge that have no human equivalent. The human figures might not represent human beings at all, but entities engaging in activities that transcend human activity. The astronomical diagrams might depict not the physical sky, but the architecture of consciousness itself, rendered in symbols that approximate something that has no name. This interpretation does not explain the manuscript. It does not decrypt it. It does not make it comprehensible, but it offers something perhaps more valuable. It offers a framework for respecting the mystery itself, for honoring the possibility that some things are meant to remain beyond comprehension. The manuscript has been studied for centuries. Brilliant minds have devoted lifetimes to attempting to decrypt its cipher. Advanced computers have been applied to the problem. Linguistic analysis, cryptographic theory, artificial intelligence, all have been brought to bear on the question of meaning. And yet, the manuscript remains sealed, resistant to every attempt at understanding. Perhaps this resistance is not a failure of human intelligence, but a success of the manuscript's design. Perhaps it was created specifically to resist decryption by ordinary means. Perhaps the message of the Voynich manuscript is not contained in any breakthrough understanding, but rather in the experience of encountering something that fundamentally resists the categories of understanding we normally employ. It is said that the manuscript teaches a lesson more profound than any specific knowledge could teach, the lesson that some mysteries are meant to remain mysterious, that some knowledge is designed to exist beyond the boundaries of comprehension, that communion with genuine mystery, the kind of mystery that cannot be solved, only encountered with reverence, is sometimes more valuable than understanding itself. We close this chapter now with the soft sound of turning pages, each one revealing nothing and everything. The whisper of vellum, the gentle scratch of ancient ink. Symbols that hold meaning only for those who have learned to think beyond the boundaries of ordinary language, or for those who have learned to surrender the need for understanding altogether. It is said that the Voynich manuscript is still being studied, that new theories emerge constantly, that each generation brings fresh eyes and new technologies to the work of attempting to unlock its secrets. Yet the manuscript continues to resist. It continues to hold its silence. It continues to exist as a monument to the possibility that some truths cannot be expressed, Some knowledge cannot be conveyed. Some meanings exist forever outside the realm of human comprehension. Perhaps this is the greatest gift the manuscript offers, not the revelation of hidden knowledge, but the expansion of human consciousness to encompass the possibility of knowledge that lies permanently beyond human reach. The acceptance that understanding is not always the goal, that sometimes the deepest communion occurs not with comprehension, but with respect for mystery itself. We fade now into the whisper of pages turning in candlelight, into the soft sound of symbols that mean nothing and everything, into the profound silence that precedes all meaning, waiting for ears that understand that listening without understanding can itself be a form of knowing. The Antikythera mechanism, starlight encoded in bronze. It is said that in 1901, in waters so deep that sunlight never reaches, sponge divers found something that should not exist. They were searching for treasures, artifacts, statues, the conventional remains of sunken ships. Instead, they discovered what would later be understood as one of the most profound mysteries ever recovered from the sea, a mechanism of such impossible sophistication that it would take nearly a century of study to begin to comprehend what it was. Imagine the moment of discovery. The diver, suspended in darkness and pressure, reaching toward a corroded lump of bronze, so encrusted with age and salt that its true nature is invisible. This is merely debris, surely a fragment of some larger object, meaningless and damaged by millennia of submersion. Yet when it is brought to light, when the salt is carefully removed, when the corrosion is gently cleaned away, something extraordinary emerges. Gears, precision-cut gears, arranged in patterns of such mathematical sophistication that modern engineers have struggled to understand their purpose. Not crudely formed, but precisely calculated. Not randomly assembled, but deliberately organized. Metal so carefully worked that it speaks of a maker who understood mathematics, astronomy, and mechanical engineering at a level that textbook history insists did not exist in the ancient world. This is the Antikythera mechanism. This is the impossible thing. This is the artifact that forces us to confront a question we would prefer not to ask. What else did they know? We must move deeper now, into the layers of this mystery. The mechanism, when fully analyzed by modern science, revealed itself to be an astronomical calculator. Its gears were designed to model the movements of celestial bodies. Its internal structure encoded mathematical relationships that corresponded to the motions of the sun, moon, and planets as they were understood in antiquity. It was, in essence, an ancient computer, a device designed to predict astronomical events, to map the heavens, to give physical form to mathematical knowledge. The sophistication is what haunts us. The precision is what unsettles. Because to create such a device requires not merely astronomical knowledge, but an understanding of mechanical engineering, mathematics, metalworking, and design that speaks of a civilization far more technologically advanced than we have been taught to believe existed 2,000 years ago. It is said that when modern scientists first attempted to recreate the mechanism's function, they could not do so. The complexity of its design exceeded what they expected from the ancient world. The mathematical relationships it encoded were so sophisticated that they required centuries of accumulated knowledge, thousands of observations of the heavens, a sophisticated mathematical system, all of which supposedly did not yet exist when the mechanism was created. Yet here it was, physical proof, bronze testimony to a knowledge we thought lost forever. This is where the meditation deepens into something more troubling. The conventional explanation, and it is offered with the certainty of those who prefer their history tidy, is that the Antikythera mechanism was an anomaly. A unique genius created it. A fortunate accident of preservation allowed it to survive when all other examples were lost. It is an outlier, they say, one brilliant mind, reaching beyond the normal limits of his civilization. But what if this explanation is itself a form of blindness? What if we are refusing to see what the mechanism is telling us? Consider this possibility. If one such mechanism survived, how many did not? If the technology existed in 100 BCE, where are the others? Where are the earlier versions? Where are the refinements and improvements that would naturally follow such an invention? Where is the evidence of a tradition of mechanism making that would have to have existed to produce such sophisticated knowledge? The answer is silence. The answer is absence. The answer is that the Antikythera mechanism stands alone, isolated, without context, without precedent, without any supporting evidence that a tradition of such technological achievement existed in the ancient world. It is like discovering a radio in ancient Rome, so far beyond the expected technological level that it can only be explained as an anomaly, an outlier, an impossible exception to the rules we have constructed about how human knowledge develops. We must sit now with a more disturbing possibility. What if the mechanism is not an anomaly, but a remnant? What if it represents not the pinnacle of an ancient technological achievement, but merely one surviving example of a far more extensive knowledge tradition that has been almost entirely lost? The historical record shows us that libraries burn. The Library of Alexandria did not destroy itself. Schools closed. Knowledge keepers were silenced, forgotten, or their knowledge was suppressed. Entire branches of human inquiry were abandoned. Technologies that had been developed were deliberately suppressed. The history of human knowledge is not merely a story of progress, but also a story of selective preservation and deliberate forgetting. What if the ancient world possessed technologies that we have been taught did not exist? What if there were mechanical computers, precision instruments, mathematical systems of such sophistication that their very existence contradicted the narrative of steady progress that we have constructed? What if someone, at some point in history, made the decision that such knowledge was dangerous, that such power should not persist, that certain branches of human achievement should be pruned from the tree of civilization? The Antikythera mechanism becomes, in this meditation, symbol of all that we have lost, not through accident or catastrophe, but through deliberate decision, not through the erosion of time, but through the active suppression of knowledge that threatened existing hierarchies, existing beliefs, existing power structures. It is said that some technologies are developed and then deliberately suppressed, that civilizations sometimes collectively decide to abandon certain paths of knowledge, that the greatest power lies not in the pursuit of all possible knowledge, but in the disciplined selection of which knowledge will be pursued and which will be allowed to vanish. The Antikythera mechanism speaks to us from the depth of the sea, asking a question we cannot answer. What else was there? What other technologies existed and disappeared? What astronomical calculations were performed? What mechanical devices were designed? What mathematical systems were understood and then forgotten? The emotional arc of this mystery moves from wonder at the achievement, wonder at the precision, wonder at the sophistication, to a deeper disquiet. We begin to understand that the disappearance of this knowledge tradition was not accidental. It was not the unfortunate erosion of time. It was chosen. Somewhere, at some point, the decision was made that this knowledge would not be preserved, that the tradition of mechanism making would be allowed to die, that the astronomical calculations would be forgotten. And then we arrive at something even more profound. The recognition that we may have inherited a world made deliberately smaller than it could have been. That the knowledge available to us has been filtered, selected, curated, not merely by the accidents of history, but by deliberate human choice. That entire branches of human achievement have been systematically pruned from our inheritance. The Antikythera mechanism is no longer merely an archaeological curiosity. It becomes a meditation on the fragility of knowledge, on the possibility of deliberate forgetting, on the question of what we have lost not through accident, but through choice. We close this chapter now, not in any place of resolution, but in the profound stillness of the sea bottom where the mechanism was found. We imagine the bronze gears, corroded by salt and time, yet still maintaining their mathematical relationships, still holding the patterns that would encode the movements of the heavens, still asking the question that cannot be answered. It is said that the stars continue their ancient dance across our sky. It is said that the mathematical relationships that the Antikythera mechanism sought to describe are still valid, still operative, still moving the cosmos according to laws that the ancients understood far better than we have given them credit for. It is said that somewhere in the ruins of lost libraries and forgotten schools, The knowledge that created such mechanisms continues to echo, waiting for ears ready to hear it. What else did they know? The question persists. The bronze gears rotate slowly in the darkness, still calculating, still preserving in their metal form the knowledge that human decision has allowed to vanish. The mechanism asks us, have we truly progressed? Or have we merely chosen a narrower path and called it progress? We fade now into the soft sound of gears turning in deep water, into the whisper of astronomical patterns encoded in bronze, into the profound silence of knowledge that may never be fully recovered, only respected for the mystery it preserves. Perhaps some technologies are meant to be forgotten. Perhaps some knowledge is dangerous in the hands of those who do not understand its cost. Perhaps the greatest wisdom is sometimes the decision to let certain powers fade from human reach. Yet the mechanism remains, still turning, still calculating, still asking the question we cannot answer, still waiting in the darkness for understanding we may never achieve. The Kumano Kodo, where mountains hold sacred memory, there is a sound that exists only in very old forests. It is not the sound of birds or wind, though these are present. It is something deeper, the accumulated whisper of 1,000 years of footsteps on stone paths worn smooth by pilgrims whose names are forgotten, whose intentions have dissolved into the mist, whose presence persists only in the shape of the earth itself. It is said that high in the mountains of Japan, where the landscape folds into itself like a meditation, there exist ancient paths that are not merely routes from one place to another. They are thresholds. They are instruments. They are a curriculum written not in words or books, but in stone and slope, and the slow unfolding of landscape that reveals itself only to those who walk it with intention and surrender. These are the Kumano Kodo, the sacred pilgrimage paths. It is said they have existed for over 1,000 years, though the knowledge of how old they truly are, and who first walked them, and what purpose first shaped them, has been absorbed into the forest silence. The paths connect 3 sacred temples, Kumano Hongo Taisha, Kumano Nachi Taisha, and Kumano Hayatama Taisha, in a geometric configuration that seems too precise to be accidental, too meaningful to be arbitrary. Imagine beginning such a journey. You stand at the threshold. The paths stretch before you, worn smooth by millions of feet, polished by the passage of countless pilgrims. The stone is ancient. The moss that grows upon it is older still. And as you step forward, as your foot touches the first stone, you understand without words, this path was made for you. Not for you individually, but for something in you that has always known this walk was coming. We must move deeper now, into the meditative space where geography becomes spiritual teaching. The paths are not random wanderings through beautiful forest. They are designed. This is what becomes apparent as you walk them: the precision of the angles, the way the landscape reveals itself in particular moments, the relationship between temple and terrain. The paths are instruments of transformation. This is the central mystery of the Kumano Kodo. They were not created merely to move bodies from one location to another. They were created to move consciousness through stages of awakening, stages of dissolution, stages of spiritual becoming. The landscape itself is the teacher. The forest itself is the curriculum. It is said that the early accounts speak of ascetics and mystics, those who could read meaning in the texture of bark, in the arrangement of stones, in the way light fell through ancient trees. These were not merely spiritual seekers who happened to walk these mountains. They were designers of consciousness. They understood that certain truths cannot be taught through language, but must be experienced through the body, through walking, through the slow surrender to a landscape that knows more than you do. Consider the geometry of the paths. They do not connect the temples by the most direct route. They do not minimize effort or time. Instead, they maximize revelation. They spiral. They ascend and descend in patterns that suggest astronomical knowledge. The angles of approach to each temple seem to align with celestial configurations. The views that emerge at certain points seem calculated to produce specific psychological effects. The relationship between walker and landscape seems orchestrated with precision. Who designed this? This is the question that cannot quite be answered. The historical records speak of ascetics and mystics, but their names are lost. Their intentions are encoded in stone and forest rather than in writing. Yet the precision of the design, the way the paths seem to guide consciousness through specific stages of transformation, suggests deliberate intention. This was not accidental. This was not random. This was a carefully constructed system for spiritual development, hidden not in words but in geography itself. The emotional arc shifts now from curiosity to something closer to reverence. As you walk the paths, as you surrender to the rhythm of footsteps on ancient stone, as you allow your body to be guided by the landscape rather than by your mind, something begins to shift in your consciousness. The forest is no longer merely beautiful scenery. It becomes a teacher. The paths are no longer merely ways to travel. They become a language you are learning to read with your body. This is the deepest truth of the Kumano Kodo. Some knowledge can only be learned through walking. The pilgrimage is not a means to an end. The pilgrimage is the knowledge itself. The transformation that occurs is not something that happens at the temples, but something that happens on the paths themselves in the moment-by-moment surrender to the landscape, in the gradual dissolution of the boundary between self and place, in the slow recognition that you are not walking through the forest so much as the forest is walking through you. It is said that certain sacred places are activated only through correct approach. Not merely physically correct, though the paths are precisely mapped, but spiritually correct. The correct approach is the vulnerable approach. It is the approach of one who has left behind the certainties of the lowland world, who has climbed into a realm where time is different, where language is less efficient, where the body begins to understand things the mind cannot grasp. The knowledge that the Kumano Kodo teaches is encrypted in the landscape itself. It cannot be translated into words without losing its essential nature. The meaning lies not in any particular temple or any particular view, but in the accumulation of walking, in the rhythm of breath and footstep, in the gradual dissolution of the boundary between inner and outer landscape. The mountain teaches you how to listen. The forest teaches you how to surrender. The paths teach you that some truths can only be known through the body's movement through space. The paths are still there, still worn smooth by millions of feet, still guiding pilgrims through the same stages of transformation, still encoding the knowledge of ascetics and mystics who understood that geography is not merely physical description, but a form of spiritual architecture. It is said that the mountains remember every footstep. It is said that the stone paths hold the imprint of every pilgrim's intention. It is said that if you walk with attention, with reverence, with the willingness to be transformed, the landscape itself will teach you what your mind could never understand. We close this chapter now not with understanding, but with the soft sound of footsteps on ancient stone. We imagine the paths continuing through the forest, through the mist, through the suspended time of the mountains. We imagine pilgrims past, present, future, all walking the same routes, all being guided by the same landscape, all learning the same lessons that cannot be spoken. The transformation is quiet. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It occurs in the moment when you realize that you are no longer thinking about why you are walking, no longer struggling against the difficulty of the terrain, no longer trying to understand. You are simply moving with the landscape, allowing it to guide you, trusting that the paths know where to take you. The three temples await at the end of the journey, but the true gift is not in reaching them. The true gift is in the walking itself, in the slow dissolution of certainties, in the expansion of consciousness to embrace a landscape that is simultaneously external and internal, that teaches through silence, that guides through the language of stone and forest, and the accumulated intention, 1,000 years of pilgrims. It is said that those who walk the Kumano Kodo are forever changed, not through miraculous revelation, but through the quiet, persistent teaching of the landscape itself. The paths continue to work their subtle magic on all who walk them with intention. The mountains continue to hold their ancient memory. The forest continues to teach the lessons that precede language. We fade now into the sound of footsteps gradually fading into distance, into the whisper of wind through ancient trees, into the soft knowledge that the paths are still guiding consciousness toward mysteries that have no names, that can only be learned through walking, that persist in the silence of mountains that have been sacred for longer than human memory can reach. Some knowledge only echoes when we are willing to walk toward it through mist and time, When we surrender to the landscape's ancient teaching, when we understand that the true pilgrimage is not toward a destination, but toward the dissolution of the self into the vast, patient wisdom of earth and stone, and the forest's eternal silence. Göbekli Tepe. Memory before history. There exists a moment in human prehistory when the story we have been told about ourselves breaks apart. It is not a moment that can be dated precisely. It is not an event recorded in writing, because writing did not yet exist. Yet, it is a moment that archaeology has recently uncovered, a moment preserved not in words but in stone, in the careful arrangement of T-shaped pillars arranged in circles, in the evidence of intentional gathering and ritual practice in a place that should not have been built. It is said that in the highlands of Turkey, in a region of rolling hills and grasslands where the first cities would not emerge for thousands of years, where the first written words would not be inscribed for thousands of years more, there stands a temple, not merely a shrine, not a casual gathering place, a temple of such precision, such careful construction, such profound intentionality that it disrupts everything we have been taught about the development of human civilization. Imagine this moment, a time before agriculture, a time when humans still followed the seasons, still moved with the herds, still lived in the way that conventional history insists was primitive, unsophisticated, lacking the organization necessary for grand ambition. Imagine these people, hunters and gatherers, seasonal travelers, investing tremendous effort in creating something permanent, something that could not be carried, something that required sustained coordination, shared vision, collective intention. This is Göbekli Tepe, the oldest temple, the most profound question humanity has yet recovered from its own past. We must move deeper now, into the astonishment that this place evokes. The conventional narrative of human development tells us that civilization emerges from agriculture. Agriculture allows surplus. Surplus allows specialization. Specialization allows the organization necessary for monumental architecture. Temples emerge only after civilization has already developed, after cities, after writing, after the infrastructure of complex society. Göbekli Tepe inverts this logic entirely. Here, in the Anatolian highlands, people who had no agriculture, who maintained no permanent settlements, who possessed no written language, gathered seasonally to construct a place of profound sacred meaning. They carved T-shaped pillars from limestone. They arranged them in circles. They decorated them with carvings, animals, abstract symbols, representations of meaning that suggest a cosmological vision far more sophisticated than we would have expected from people living in the pre-agricultural world. It is said that the precision of the construction suggests astronomical knowledge. The alignment of the pillars seems to correspond to celestial configurations. The geometry is too exact to be accidental, too meaningful to be arbitrary. Whoever designed Göbekli Tepe understood not merely how to build, but what to build, and why it should be aligned with the movements of the stars. The builders possessed a shared vision powerful enough to unite dispersed groups. Here is where the mystery deepens profoundly. Göbekli Tepe is not a solitary achievement. The scale of construction, the coordination required, the sustained effort across multiple seasons, all suggest that different groups of people converged on this location with shared purpose. They came together, they participated in rituals of profound meaning, they built something sacred, and then they dispersed again, returning to their seasonal wanderings, carrying with them the knowledge of what they had created. The emotional arc of this chapter shifts now from astonishment to something closer to reverence, a quiet reorientation of what we understand about human capability and human consciousness. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were not primitive. They were not waiting for civilization to develop. They were not lacking in organization or vision. They were fully conscious. They were spiritually sophisticated. They were capable of extraordinary coordination. And most importantly, they chose this. They chose to build something sacred. This is where the meditation deepens into something truly sacred. The question that Göbekli Tepe poses is not merely archaeological. It is philosophical, spiritual, and it touches the very foundation of how we understand ourselves. What does it mean that the impulse toward transcendence, toward gathering, toward shared meaning, older than civilization itself? What does it mean that humans invested enormous effort in creating something sacred before they had even developed agriculture? What does it suggest about our nature, about what we truly value, about what has always driven us? The conventional narrative places the sacred after the practical. It suggests that humans first solved the problem of survival, and only then did they have the surplus capacity to create meaning. But Göbekli Tepe suggests something different. It suggests that the sacred may have always been primary, that the impulse toward gathering, toward collective meaning-making, toward the creation of sacred space, may be fundamental to what we are, secondary to practical concerns. It is said that the builders of Göbekli Tepe possessed a cosmological vision, not a vague spirituality, but an actual understanding of the cosmos, how the stars moved, what their movements meant, how those celestial patterns related to human existence. The temple itself encoded this knowledge. The pillars did not merely stand as religious symbols. They were instruments of cosmic understanding. They allowed the builders and visitors to align themselves with the movements of the heavens. Consider what this means. Humans living in the pre-agricultural world possessed not merely survival skills, but sophisticated astronomical knowledge. They possessed mathematical understanding. They possessed the ability to organize complex projects. They possessed a shared cosmology that was meaningful enough to draw people from dispersed locations to participate in its creation. We have inherited a diminished view of our prehistoric ancestors. We have imagined them as primitive, as lacking, as waiting for civilization to develop. But Göbekli Tepe suggests that we have inherited far more from our prehistoric past than we have acknowledged. We have inherited not merely genes, not merely survival skills, but a spiritual consciousness that predates everything we call civilization. The sacred precedes agriculture. The sacred precedes writing. The sacred precedes all the structures we have built to organize human society. The sacred is older than history itself. And Göbekli Tepe is its stone testimony, its material proof, its echo across 10,000 years. We close this chapter now in reverent stillness. We imagine the moment when ancient hands shaped stone in starlight. We imagine people gathering seasonally at this location, understanding without words that they were participating in something cosmic, something eternal, something that transcended individual existence. The builders knew something that we have largely forgotten. They understood that the deepest human impulse is not toward survival, but toward meaning. Not toward comfort, but toward transcendence. Not toward isolated existence, but toward gathering and shared understanding of something larger than themselves. Göbekli Tepe stands now, as it has stood for 10,000 years, a question posed in stone, a mystery encoded in pillars, a testament to human consciousness before history recorded it. The pillars still stand in their precise circles. The carvings still hold their meanings. The astronomical alignments still exist. It is said that some knowledge is older than writing. It is said that some truths are encoded not in text, but in stone, not in words, but in the very arrangement of matter. It is said that if you stand at Göbekli Tepe and look upward at the stars, you might perceive what the builders perceived: the alignment between earth and sky, the integration of human consciousness with the vast cosmos, the truth that we have always been part of something far larger than ourselves. We fade now into the soft sound of ancient chanting, of voices raised in gathering, of footsteps moving in ritual around T-shaped pillars. The sound of pilgrimage across starlit landscape, the whisper of knowledge older than words, the understanding that consciousness and the impulse toward sacred meaning are not the luxury of civilization, but the deepest inheritance of humanity itself. Some voices only echo when we have learned to listen to the silence of stone, to the stillness of mountains, to the knowledge of those who came before writing, before history, before everything we call civilization, and who understood something we are still learning to remember. The Hestalan lights. When sky becomes an oracle, there is a silence that precedes the appearance of light. It is the silence of a valley waiting, of darkness holding its breath, of the space between what is known and what emerges from beyond knowing. It is the silence of northern night, when the stars seem close enough to touch, when the boundary between earth and sky becomes permeable, when the ordinary world opens into something other. It is said that in the Hestalan Valley of Norway, In a remote place where mountains embrace a narrow strip of earth, there has been, for centuries, a phenomenon that defies easy explanation. Not once, not a few times, but repeatedly, consistently, persistently. Lights appear in the sky, not meteors, not aircraft, not any phenomenon that conventional science can fully account for. Balls of luminescence that move with intelligence, that seem to observe, that appear to communicate. Imagine standing in that valley at night. The darkness is absolute, the kind of darkness that exists in places far from human settlement, where the sky still owns the night. And then, without warning, without announcement, without any logical precursor, a light appears. Not gradually, but suddenly present, hanging in the air, moving with a grace that seems intentional, demonstrating a knowledge of three-dimensional space that suggests not accident, but purpose. The light does not threaten, it does not attack, it observes. The witnesses describe this consistently, across centuries, across cultures, across different languages and frameworks of understanding. The lights are curious. They seem to watch those who watch them. They seem, perhaps, to wait for something, acknowledgement, recognition, or some form of communication that has not yet been adequately offered. This is where the meditation begins, with the sense that something is trying to speak to us, and we have not yet learned its language. We must move deeper now, into the testimony of those who have encountered these lights. It is said that farmers who worked the Hessdalen Valley saw them regularly, that indigenous peoples whose oral traditions stretched back generations spoke of the lights as if they were ancient presences, familiar visitors, participants in a long conversation that predated written history, that modern scientists, equipped with instruments and theories, arrived to study the phenomenon and found themselves unable to explain what they observed. The descriptions are consistent across time and across different witnesses. The lights are usually golden or white. They move with apparent intelligence, changing direction suddenly, accelerating and decelerating without following the physics of ordinary objects. They appear to respond to observation, changing behavior based on whether they are being watched. They seem to communicate through pattern and rhythm, through sequences of appearance and disappearance, through movements that suggest meaning encoded in light itself. The scientific explanations offered so far: plasma phenomena, unusual atmospheric conditions, misidentifications of conventional phenomena account for some sightings, but the consistent reports of intelligent behavior, of response to human attention, of apparent communication, exceed what these explanations can encompass. There is something about the Hessdalen lights that resists categorization, something that seems to exist outside the frameworks we have constructed for understanding the universe. It is said that the lights seem to possess properties that violate conventional physics. They appear and vanish instantaneously, without transition. They move at speeds that would require accelerations impossible for physical objects. They change direction at angles that should be impossible without visible means of propulsion. They demonstrate, in essence, a relationship to space and time that differs fundamentally from how physical objects behave in our measurable universe. Yet they are witnessed. They are documented. They are photographed. They leave behind, in human consciousness and in the historical record, the undeniable evidence of their existence. The emotional arc of this chapter shifts now from rational skepticism, the attempt to explain the phenomenon through known science, to something more profound. A gentle opening toward mystery, a recognition that consciousness and cosmos might be far more entangled than our current paradigms acknowledge. A willingness to consider that intelligence in the universe might manifest in forms we have not yet learned to recognize. It is said that in ancient times, before science existed to categorize and explain, humans encountered similar mysteries and understood them as oracles. Moments when the boundary between human and divine became permeable. Moments when communication occurred beyond the structures of language. Moments when the cosmos itself seemed to speak directly to human consciousness. The Hessdalen lights might be understood in this tradition, not as a problem to be solved, but as an oracle, an invitation to deeper perception, a statement that the reality we inhabit is far larger, far more mysterious, far more alive with consciousness than our conventional understanding permits. Consider the profound implications. What if the lights are a form of intelligence? Not biological intelligence, as we understand it, but intelligence nonetheless. Consciousness without flesh, awareness without the structures we associate with life. What if the sky itself, that vast realm we have learned to see as empty space, is actually alive with presences we have not yet learned to perceive? Or perhaps the lights represent something even more fundamental. Perhaps they demonstrate that the categories we have constructed, biological versus non-biological, conscious versus non-conscious, intelligent versus non-intelligent, are themselves inadequate. Perhaps they suggest that consciousness and intentionality exist in forms we have not yet imagined, in substrates we have not yet recognized, in relationships to space and time that our physics has not yet encompassed. The valley that houses these lights becomes, in this meditation, thin place, a location where the veil between worlds is worn transparent, where what is usually hidden becomes visible, where the ordinary and the extraordinary meet without conflict. The Hestelan lights are not invading our world from outside it. They are revealing what is already present, a dimension of reality that exists alongside our ordinary perception, waiting only for us to develop the consciousness necessary to recognize it. It is said that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but to be lived with, that the greatest wisdom sometimes lies not in answers, but in the expansion of our capacity to hold profound questions. The Hestelan lights persist year after year, century after century, revealing themselves to those who come to the valley with open attention, with willingness to perceive beyond the categories of conventional science. We close this chapter now in the silence of the Norwegian night. We imagine standing in the Hestelan Valley, in darkness so complete it feels like a presence itself. We imagine the moment when the first light appears, not gradually, but suddenly present, as if it has always been there and only now becomes visible to eyes ready to see it. What are they? The question persists, unanswered, perhaps unanswerable through the structures of language and conventional science. But perhaps the question itself misses the point. Perhaps the lights are not here to provide answers, but to transform the one who asks. Perhaps they are here to demonstrate that reality is far stranger, far more alive, far more conscious than we have permitted ourselves to believe. It is said that those who witness the Hestelan lights are forever changed, not through any dramatic event, not through contact or communication in the ordinary sense, but through the simple encounter with something that their mind cannot explain, that their science cannot contain, that their categories cannot encompass. In that moment of encounter with the inexplicable, something shifts. The boundaries of what seems possible expand. The certainty that we understand the nature of reality fractures, revealing the vastness of mystery that lies beneath. The lights continue their dance. They appear in the night sky, moving with grace and apparent intelligence. They do not demand belief. They do not require explanation. They simply persist in their mystery, offering themselves to those who come to the valley prepared to receive them. It is said that the sky is not empty. It is said that the universe is far more alive than we have acknowledged. It is said that if we listen carefully enough, if we open ourselves to perception beyond language, the cosmos will speak to us in ways that transcend conventional understanding. We fade now into the soft sound of northern night, the whisper of wind across the valley, the distant sense of movement in the darkness above, the profound silence that precedes the appearance of light, the understanding that some mysteries are not invitations to solve, but invitations to expand our consciousness, to recognize that our understanding of reality is vastly smaller than reality itself. Perhaps the lights have always been here. Perhaps they are waiting, not to be understood, but to be respected. Perhaps their greatest gift is not the revelation of what they are, but the opening of our perception to the vastness of what remains unknown, unknowable, eternally mysterious. Some voices only echo when we have learned to listen in darkness, when we have surrendered our need for certainty, when we have accepted that the sky above us holds mysteries far deeper than our science can reach. The shards of Babel, linguistic echoes of a unified tongue. There is a moment in listening to a foreign language when you hear something familiar, a sound, a pattern, a way of shaping breath into meaning that resonates as if you have heard it before, in some depth of memory that precedes conscious knowledge. You do not understand the words, yet something in them touches recognition, something ancient, something that suggests that beneath the surface of our different languages lies a deeper truth, a whispered echo of something all humans once spoke in common. It is said that if you listen carefully enough to the world's languages, if you trace words back through etymology and phonetic structure, if you follow the threads of meaning across cultures separated by oceans and mountains and millennia of time, you will discover something extraordinary. You will find fragments, shards, echoes of a unified tongue that predates all our diversity. Not necessarily a single language as we normally understand it, but a shared framework of meaning, a common way of organizing sound and concept, a linguistic memory buried deep in the structure of all human speech. It is said that the words we use to name the most sacred things, mother, water, star, sacred itself, these words carry resonances that connect across unrelated languages. They appear in languages that should have no contact with one another, separated by geographical distances so vast that conventional contact is impossible. Yet the words remain similar. The concepts remain aligned. The sounds echo the same across human diversity. Imagine discovering this. Imagine realizing that beneath the babble of human languages, beneath the surface confusion and apparent incomprehensibility, there exists a hidden unity, a common ground, a shared linguistic memory that all humanity carries, whether consciously or not. This is where the meditation begins, with the recognition that we are not as fragmented as we appear, that beneath our differences lies an ancient connection, a linguistic thread that binds all human consciousness together. We must move deeper now, into the mysterious territory of linguistic universals. It is said that across human languages, certain patterns recur, certain sounds appear in unrelated tongues, certain grammatical structures replicate in geographically separated cultures, certain fundamental concepts, the sacred, the maternal, the elemental, are named in ways that suggest not coincidence, but inheritance. Consider the word for mother. In language after language, across continents and centuries, variations appear. Ma, Maimon, Mama, Madre. Not identical, but fundamentally similar. Not a borrowing from one culture to another, but a deeper resonance, as if all human mouths, regardless of where they are shaped by culture and geography, reach for similar sounds when naming the source of life itself. Or consider the word for water. Across Indo-European languages, aqua, agua, voda. Again, not identical, but containing a common root, a shared phonetic memory. The concept is so fundamental, so essential to human existence, that it seems to have retained its original sound shape across millennia and millions of speakers. The emotional arc of this exploration shifts now from curiosity to something deeper, a sense of profound connection. Beneath the apparent fragmentation of human language lies a unity. Beneath the diversity that makes communication across cultures difficult lies a shared root, a common origin. We are not as separate as we seem. We are not as divided as our languages suggest. It is said that certain sounds appear in all human languages. Certain basic concepts are expressed in similar ways across cultures that have no historical contact. Certain fundamental categories of meaning, the distinction between singular and plural, the concept of past and present, the relationship between self and other, these appear to be hardwired into human consciousness, expressed again and again across the diversity of human speech. What if this is not coincidence? What if these linguistic universals are the remnants of something older? What if they are shards of an original unified language, or at least a shared linguistic framework that all humans inherited before the great diversification began? We arrive now at the deepest meditation of this chapter, the possibility that the scattering of language was not a punishment, but a multiplication. That the fragmentation was not primarily destructive, but protective. Consider what happens when meaning is unified. A single authoritative language allows a single authoritative interpretation. A unified tongue permits total control over what can be thought, what can be expressed, what can be understood. But when meaning is scattered, when a single language fragments into thousands of tongues, something remarkable happens. Meaning becomes distributed. Truth becomes multivalent. Core insights survive precisely because they can be expressed in multiple ways, encoded in multiple languages, preserved in forms that cannot all be suppressed simultaneously. It is said that as language fragmented, meaning became more resilient. As human speech multiplied, the essential truths carried within it became harder to erase, harder to distort, harder for any single authority to control. The very scattering that seemed like loss became, paradoxically, a form of protection. We are all still speaking fragments of an original language. This is the profound truth that linguistic archaeology reveals. Beneath our Mandarin and Spanish and Swahili and Finnish and thousands of other tongues, there exists a shared linguistic root. Not a language we consciously speak, but a language we speak unconsciously, embedded in the structure of our thoughts, encoded in the deep patterns of meaning-making that all humans share. Translation, poetry, and metaphor become, in this understanding, attempts to recover that original unified expression. When we struggle to translate a concept from one language to another, we are encountering the gaps created by linguistic fragmentation. When we use poetry and metaphor, we are attempting to speak beyond the limitations of fragmented language, to reach toward the unified expression that lies beneath all our different tongues. The search for linguistic unity is itself a form of sacred longing. In seeking the origins of language, we are seeking the origins of consciousness itself. We are attempting to reach back to a moment when all humans shared not merely a language, but a unified way of understanding reality. A moment before we learned to be different from each other. A moment when the sounds we made carried not division, but connection. We close this chapter now in profound quietness. We rest in the recognition that beneath our linguistic diversity lies a hidden unity. That the words we speak, whether in languages separated by oceans or by the simple passage of centuries, all carry echoes of something ancient, something shared, something that connects all of humanity in a way that transcends cultural and geographical boundaries. It is said that if you listen carefully enough, you can hear the original language speaking through all our diverse tongues. You can perceive the common roots beneath apparent difference. You can recognize that we are all, in essence, speaking variations of a single utterance, the first utterance of human consciousness reaching toward expression, attempting to name what is sacred, what is essential, what binds us together, despite all the forces that divide us. The search for the origins of language is the search for ourselves. It is the attempt to understand what we are, where we come from, what unites us beneath the surface of our differences. The linguistic shards of Babel are not merely fragments of a lost language. They are clues to our shared humanity. They are evidence that beneath our diversity lies a fundamental unity. They are the whispered promise that we can still reach across the barriers of language and culture to touch something essential, something ancient, something that has never truly been lost. We fade now into the soft sound of languages speaking simultaneously, a cacophony that gradually resolves into harmony. Thousands of tongues discovering that beneath their different sounds lies a single resonance, a unified breath, a shared origin, the memory of a time when all humans spoke with one voice, and still do, if only we listen deeply enough to hear it. It is said that the fragments are still speaking. It is said that the original language continues to echo through all our modern mouths. It is said that in the spaces between words, in the places where translation fails, in the depths of metaphor and poetry, the unified tongue still whispers, calling us home to the recognition of our shared linguistic origin, our common consciousness, our fundamental unity, despite all appearances of separation. Some voices only echo when we have learned to hear them in every language, to recognize them in every culture, to understand that we have never truly been divided, only diversified, distributed across the earth, speaking the same essential truth, in 1,000 different ways. The sleeping giants, WHAT, rests beneath our vision. There exists a moment in human history when our eyes finally opened to something that had always been visible, something that had been waiting for us for thousands of years. It is the moment when we learned to see from above, when aircraft and satellites permitted us to perceive the earth not from the ground, where we have always stood, but from the vantage point of sky, the vantage point that something, someone, was counting on us to eventually achieve. It is said that across the world, carved into hillsides and landscapes, Arranged in vast geometries across plains and deserts, there exist enormous figures, not small, not modest, figures of such tremendous scale that a human standing at ground level, walking among them, would perceive only disconnected lines, meaningless arrangements of stone and earth. The true form of these figures can only be comprehended from a height that, for most of human history, was impossible to achieve. Imagine this paradox. A civilization invests enormous effort in creating art. They work for years, decades perhaps, moving earth and stone, carving hillsides, arranging landscape elements into precise patterns. They achieve this through coordination, through mathematical knowledge, through shared vision. And then they create something that no one for thousands of years could actually see. Something invisible from the ground, something visible only to eyes that could perceive from the sky. Why? This is the question that opens the meditation. Why would ancient peoples create massive art forms that could only be appreciated from a perspective impossible in their time? The conventional answers: territorial markers, religious offerings, ceremonial purposes, all seem insufficient for the sheer audacity of the endeavor. These are not small additions to the landscape. These are transformations of continental scale. These are statements written upon the earth itself, using the earth as the medium. It is said that the Badlands Guardians of Canada, a figure carved into the landscape that resembles a human face in profile, could never be perceived by those who created it. The hill figures of England, White Horse of Uffington, Longmen of Wilmington, were created by cultures that had no way to see them. The geoglyphs of Peru, the geoglyphs of other continents, all share this characteristic. All were created for eyes that could not have existed. Until now, until our time, until we developed the technology to perceive what they had created. We must move deeper now, into the unsettling wonder of this recognition. What if these figures were not meant to be seen by the people who created them? What if they were created for someone else? For something else? For eyes that could perceive from above? The emotional arc shifts here, from curiosity about method to deeper speculation about intention. These figures suggest cultures possessed astronomical knowledge. The alignments are too precise to be accidental. The proportions are too exact to be random. The geometric relationships are too sophisticated to rise from simple ornamentation. It is said that the creators of these figures looked upward. They possessed a vision that extended beyond immediate human perception. They thought in cosmic scales. They understood that the earth itself could be written upon, that landscape could become text, that continents could become a language. Consider what this implies. A civilization dedicates resources to creating art that only someone looking down from the sky could perceive. What does that suggest about their understanding of the cosmos? What does it suggest about their belief regarding who or what might be looking down? Were they creating messages for the gods? For celestial beings? For something we cannot name? Or were they creating messages for us? For a distant future when humans would finally develop the ability to see as the sky sees? Were they leaving instructions? Were they leaving proof? Were they leaving a question? It is said that there is a profound difference between a message created for one's contemporaries and a message created for the distant future. The former must be comprehensible within current frameworks of understanding. The latter can remain mysterious, can exceed current comprehension, can trust that future eyes will eventually perceive what present eyes cannot. The sleeping giants rest in plain sight. We walk upon them without seeing them. We live on continents that are covered with vast messages written in stone and earth, in landscape arrangements and geometric precision. We have inherited a world that is quite literally inscribed with meaning, yet for most of human history, we lack the vision to read it. We sit now with the possibility that landscape itself can be written upon, that continents can become texts, that our entire planet is covered with messages we are only now learning to decipher. Each hill figure becomes a word in this vast language. Each arrangement of geoglyphs becomes a sentence. Each continental landscape becomes a library written at a scale that required new technology to decode. The earth itself is a text. The ground beneath our feet is written language. The hillsides we pass without seeing their true form are speaking in a language we are only beginning to learn. It is said that we live on a palimpsest. that beneath our modern cities and roads and structures lie older voices still speaking, still trying to communicate across the centuries. Beneath the asphalt and concrete, the ancient artists left their messages. Beneath our feet, the sleeping giants rest, waiting with infinite patience for eyes that can finally perceive them. The creators knew something profound. They understood that we would eventually develop the vision to see what they had made. They believed in future eyes. They trusted that someday, humans would learn to perceive from heights their ancestors could not achieve. They left their messages not for their own time, but for a time far distant, when we would have developed the technology and the consciousness to recognize what had always been there. This is the sacred recognition of this chapter. We are living on a text written by our ancestors. We are surrounded by messages from those who came before. We walk daily upon art of tremendous scale and sophistication, perceiving only fragments, seeing only details, unable to comprehend the whole without ascending to the sky. Yet now, we can ascend. Now, we have the technology. Now, we can finally see what they created. And in that seeing, we are completing a conversation that began thousands of years ago. The ancient artists are speaking to us across time, and for the first time in human history, we are finally learning to listen. We close this chapter now with the image of a continent slowly revealing itself to aerial perception. We imagine viewing the Earth from above, whether through aircraft, through satellite, or through the visionary perception of consciousness that transcends physical limitation. We imagine seeing the shapes emerge, slowly recognizing that what appeared to be random features of landscape are actually carefully composed figures, sophisticated designs, messages written with geological permanence. It is said that the oldest language of all is the language of Earth itself. It is written not in alphabets or symbols, but in shape and stone and the patient geography of meaning. It is a language that predates human language. It is a language spoken by the landscape, by the arrangement of hills and valleys, by the curves of rivers and the placement of mountains. The sleeping giants are not sleeping merely in the sense of being dormant. They are sleeping in the sense that their full meaning can only be perceived by those who have learned to see them from above, who have achieved the vision, the altitude, the expanded perception that allows comprehension of their form. They sleep beneath layers of ordinary perception, waiting for awakening, waiting for the moment when human consciousness extends beyond ground-level vision into the perspective of sky. That moment has arrived. We are learning to read the oldest language. We are discovering that we live on a text more vast and more beautiful and more profound than we could have imagined. The Earth itself is speaking. It has always been speaking. We are only now developing the ears or the eyes to hear what it has been saying. We fade now into the soft sound of wind across vast landscape, carrying the whisper of messages written in stone, the gentle rustle of meaning encoded in geography. The understanding that above us, below us, surrounding us, the sleeping giants rest not in death, but in infinite patience, waiting for the moment when human consciousness finally rises high enough to perceive them fully, to comprehend them completely, to complete the conversation that began when the first stone was moved, and the first hill was carved with intention that extended beyond the lifetime of those who shaped it. It is said that some messages are meant to wait. Some truths are meant to remain hidden until we are ready to perceive them. Some knowledge is preserved not in libraries or scrolls, but in the very shape of the Earth itself, written in a language that requires us to learn to see from a height we have not yet fully reached. We are still learning to read. The continents are still speaking. The sleeping giants continue their patient vigil, waiting for eyes that understand that the greatest literature is not written in books, but written upon the world itself. Waiting for readers who have finally learned to look at the Earth from above and see the text they have always been walking upon.